Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Biome podcast with me, Robi, and Kate and Emma. And today we are going to be going through part 2 of our climate change themed podcast duology. There's only 2 of them, so part 2 is the last part. But we hope you enjoyed part 1. Part 1 was all, what are the causes of climate change? What actually is global climate change? We went through a kind of overview of how it's different this time to previous climatic changes, why it's our fault and why we should why we should solve it. And we also went through a bit of a harrowing, heavy-going segment where we were like, okay, what are we losing to climate change? What will we lose? And it was all a bit doom and gloom. But today, in part 2, we're going to have, if not maybe not so much upbeat, but definitely a more positive episode for you today, because we are going to be talking about the importance of individual and systemic action in combating and reversing climate change. So yes, today we are going to be talking about individual and systemic action to combat and reverse climate change. So it's all about what we can do, what governments can do, and what corporations can do. So yeah, hopefully a bit more of an upbeat episode. But yeah, we hope you enjoyed part 1. This is part 2. We're going to start with should we do like a little introduction of how we broke down this episode and how we're kind of framing this debate?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. So when we kind of started discussing how best to tackle climate change, we kind of agreed on these 4 quite broad groups that are integral in the fight against climate change. And that is individuals, collective individuals, private corporations and companies, and the governments of the world. So by individuals, we mean just, normal people, literally me, you guys, people out there listening. And everyone has, or at least everyone should have, kind of equal rights to live on this planet and to share in the resources available. And by the same token, just by existing, everyone is exhibiting a carbon footprint. That's kind of unavoidable. Because you are here, you do have an impact on the planet. So therefore, we are really integral in the fight against climate change. Collective individuals refers to just groups of individuals working together.
We're all individuals.
Yeah, exactly. It's when we all come really together as a group, and that's what we've kind of termed collective individuals. So think grassroots movements, protests, just any form of collective action. Private corporations are kind of your big firms with big money. So we're talking people like Apple, Google, Facebook, all the kind of really big names, but also just any private operating kind of corporation. So that includes private farming corporations. And we just kind of wanted to explore how much responsibility for tackling climate change falls on these institutions and how are they different to just your everyday individual. And lastly, government power comes down to that kind of systemic power, our systems, our legal system. How does that contribute to climate crisis, or how can that be used to help solve it? And how important is legislation and government power in the fight against climate change? So during this podcast, we want to unpack the differences between these 4 tiers and how much responsibility and power each group has in tackling the climate crisis. We kind of want to explore questions like, do your individual actions matter if the government isn't taking enough action? So does walking to work actually make a difference, or is it just big changes that we need, like massive national shifts to renewable energy, that make the difference? Do individuals have more or less responsibility than private firms or than the government? And how much power do individuals actually have? Do we need individual action if governments just take charge, or if private companies just take charge? We kind of want to discuss all these questions and the links between these 4 tiers and how they can work together or against each other, and what it means going forward. So as Robi said, we hope this episode is more upbeat than the last one. We hope it gives you some insight again into the complexities of climate change from a more social perspective. But this episode is focused on action. So we hope it's a bit more motivating and a bit more empowering moving forward. So we're going to start with individuals and individual action to combat climate change. So Emma, do you want to kick us off with some stuff individuals can be doing?
Yeah, sounds good. And before we talk about this, I just want to highlight that individuals really do kind of have a big impact. You may feel a bit overwhelmed by all of this, but we kind of want to break it down and make you realise that there are things that you can do in your day-to-day life that can make a difference. So I'll kind of start by talking about, there's a lot of talk at the moment kind of about plant-based diets and kind of how that links in with climate change and emissions and things like that. And we're going to do a separate podcast on this further down the line because it's there's very, very complex and there's a lot to it. But just as an overview, kind of in our minds, to combat climate change, the global food systems basically need an overhaul. So the current methods and the scale of food production is just not sustainable. So we're depleting and exhausting our soils, we're destroying habitats, causing biodiversity loss. So we talked about all of that last week. And just for a stat to make you realise how important our diets and what we consume is, so a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food.
Wow.
And more than half of food emissions come from animal products. So
and when you say those emissions come from food, is that like coming from the food itself or the kind of the manufacture of it?
So it will be the whole process.
The whole thing.
So from production in the soils, the way it's farmed, the way it's managed, all the way through transport, storage, cooking, and food waste and things like that. So that's something I think we don't think about as well, is that it's taken all this energy and effort to produce it, and then in throwing away large amounts of food, that's basically throwing away or wasting all this food, which is contributing to emissions as well. So kind of as individuals, you can make a difference. So reducing food loss and food waste is really, really important, not only for just reducing food waste because we have a global sort of food disparity massively around the world, but also on top of this, if you then transition to more kind of sustainable diets, this could actually have a really, really big impact on emissions. So, and also it wouldn't just tackle emissions. So if we sort of change and are more aware about what we eat, this could tackle things like soil degradation, desertification, and could just create more resilient farming ecosystems, which is absolutely what we need for ecosystems to be able to cope in the future. So there's been lots of studies that have found that the production of animal-based foods is associated with higher greenhouse gas emissions compared to plant-based foods. So just to give you some numbers for this, so this is in greenhouse gas emissions in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per day. So this is basically the emissions from a particular diet. So they found for high meat eaters, again, we'll put the link to the paper so you can see what that actually means. That was 7.19 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per day. And then you go down to medium meat eaters, that was 5.63 kilograms. You go down to low meat eaters, that was 4.67. Fish eaters, 3.91. Vegetarians, 3.81. And vegans, 2.89. So
that's
just
insane.
The numbers are quite different there. And so
basically a kind of a high meat eater is like 2.5 times more emissions per day than a vegan, and almost double that of a vegetarian. Like that's a really big difference.
Yeah, I don't think I realised quite how big it was, and I think a lot of that is associated with the inefficiencies of the meat and dairy industry. So just the idea that we're using huge amounts of land to grow cereal crops to feed animals. So it's this massively inefficient chain of huge amounts of land are being used, and it's not even for food production. And then you've also got, like we talked about with the cows, ruminants just produce a lot of methane as well. So there's a lot of emissions there.
That's a really interesting point you made about all the cereal feeding the meat that then we eat. And that's 3 steps when you could conceivably cut out the middleman and streamline the whole process. And I think I've only in the last maybe 2 years got transitioned to a vastly more plant-based diet than before. And before I did that, I was kind of like, oh, the problem is cows and that's it. And I feel like a lot of the time we don't realize that the problem is not just the cow; it's the cow and then the soy that feeds the cow, because that's, a cow. How many fields do you need for a cow farm? Loads of fields, and then you also need loads and loads of soy fields to feed those cows.
Yeah. And I think there was quite a nice quote by David Attenborough to sort of sum that up, what you were just saying, Robi. So he was saying that there just isn't enough space for billions of meat eaters. So if people switch to a largely plant-based diet, we're not saying everyone go vegan tomorrow, far from it. It's just largely plant-based and more sustainable is what we're talking about. And so if people did that, we would need only half the land that we do at the moment for current agriculture. So huge amounts of land which would then be available either for sort of rewilding, creating more natural spaces, or more food for actual human consumption rather than this middleman of meat.
Yeah, so kind of it's like the opposite. I know in part 1 we kind of talked about the cascading impacts of climate change, and you kind of have, I don't know what the opposite of a cascade is, like a climb up of when you talk about climate change solutions, they kind of knock into each other to help make it better, because if we only used half the land, then we could, like you say, rewild, particularly forests. And the more forests we have, reforestation helps us more in tackling climate change. So in the same way, the bad things got worse. If we kind of make these big shifts, the good things get better.
No, I really like that. That's a really good way of putting it. And I think the last point to make on diet, I think, is also just to be aware. The idea of a sustainable diet is being aware of where your food comes from. So the food mileage on food is also very significant. So this is meat and vegetable products alike. So if we're eating local, in-season food, that's one of the best things you can do. If you grow your own, that's even better. There's no food miles and emissions are virtually zero. Because, so say for asparagus, for example, in the UK, has the highest carbon footprint compared to other vegetables.
Oh no, I love asparagus.
I mean, it depends where you get it. If you grew it locally on a farm, it's different. But a lot of it is imported by air from Peru. So they've used lots of pesticides, lots of chemicals, and also you've got the food mileage. So that's just something to be aware. It's kind of buying local, in season, and growing as much of your own stuff as possible is good.
And there's also something of a link there. And, I'm not a dietitian at all, but I do remember reading, a lot of the kind of the fascination with... I think they're called paleo diets. We should eat as our ancestors did 11,000 years ago, which to my mind is completely bonkers, because we're not the same people we were 11,000 years ago. And I can prove that by comparative physiology. But there's quite an interesting thing about, how most species in their natural environment will go through phases of kind of glut and lean period, and you wouldn't have a steady diet across the entire lifespan of the individual. You'd have fluxes as different food sources came seasonally into abundance. And I can't remember who. I'll try and find this study, and again, if I do find it, I'll put the link in the description to this video. But there was, I think, a dietitian or a nutritionist came up and said, actually, if you eat just what's seasonally grown in your native country, or your native region or whatever, there might be measurable positive health benefits just for your gut biota to go through those seasonal variations of breaking down different foods. So sorry, that was a complete tangent, but just something that popped into my mind, and I thought, that might be interesting.
No, I think that's good. And like Robi and I in our house last year, we had a little poster up that one of our housemates put up of the vegetables that were currently in season, which I found quite helpful, being like, okay, I'm going to the local farmer's market today. Maybe I shouldn't buy a cauliflower, I should buy a parsnip, or whatever it was. So it was useful having that. But there are lots of other things we can do, can't we? Do you want to talk about some other things, Robi, in our day-to-day lives?
And so this is quite an interesting point I'm quite keen to talk about, because a lot of the time you might think that you can't get on a plane or you can't drive a car if you're serious about the environmental crisis, which isn't entirely the case, because everyone's situation is different. We need to acknowledge the nuance in these things. And obviously, cars really do make the world go round. So to talk about cars and how you can make your driving habits more environmentally sustainable. And again, this links into, this is an individual action which you can take and which you are directly responsible for. The biggest thing that comes into my head, which is, almost no cost to yourself, is checking your tyre pressure. So driving without the correct tyre pressure on your car can actually dramatically increase the amount of fuel burnt in a single journey. And obviously that means you then refill the car sooner, and then, that's more carbon emissions because, cars produce CO2. And also carbon monoxide, which is another greenhouse gas, quite a nasty one. So actually, all you have to do, a lot of the time, I think on my car, it's on the inside of the door. There's a little bit of writing which tells you the pressure, and you can get a little pump that does it. Or in the glove box, there's usually a book. I'm not very technical when it comes to cars. It's a book. It's got things in about your car. So it's really simple just to check your tyre pressure and make sure it's correctly done up. I think kind of the one step up from that, which my family have been looking into quite a lot at the minute, is consider buying an electric car. Obviously, having an electric car massively reduces your carbon footprint in terms of the fuel that you produce on the day to day. Obviously, there's still a carbon footprint associated with the manufacture of that car. But if you look at the manufacture carbon footprint and compare it to the carbon footprint that the car produces in its lifetime of being driven, if you can cut out that second category, you effectively slash the carbon footprint of that car by more than half.
Also, I think moving forwards, like if the power company sort of providing this electricity to run the car when you charge it, if they are switching to 100% renewables, then that is hugely positive, because at the moment I think they're not quite there with being 100% renewable powered, but it's coming. I think it's coming in the future.
And even if it's not 100% renewable power, to my mind, it would still be worth going electric if you can. The downside of that is, at the minute, electric cars are, generally speaking, somewhat limited in range because of the way the batteries work. The efficiency of the battery hasn't been perfected, and also more expensive. So for those two reasons, it's not feasible for my family at the minute to get an electric car. But the government subsidises electric cars, and as each new model comes out, the old one gets cheaper. And so we're constantly watching how, the government subsidies are working for this thing. It's very exciting. We're all kind of like, ooh, what brand is coming out now? And so it's just, something to be aware of as this technology becomes a lot more prevalent. And obviously hybrid cars, again, it's not solving the problem, but it's a very positive first step that you can do in your everyday life. And it's not something you need to worry about. You don't need to think, oh my God, Google need to take more responsibility. It's a very personal thing. It's individual action. And I think it's well worth the doing. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting transport-themed one.
Yeah, I agree. I think I really like the tyre pressure, because that's something really small that you can just do to help your individual carbon footprint. I think talking about transport, we all know that the transport industry is a massive polluter. We don't want to hound that point too much, because I think this is something we do all know. But just quickly, in 2018, the transport industry accounted for 28.2% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's no joke. The transport industry has a lot to answer for. This, of course, includes the aviation industry. So flights are kind of the sort of almost public enemy number one sometimes in the fight against climate change. They really get a lot of publicity, but cars as well, and of course public transport, any kind of fuel powered transport has a carbon footprint, and these greenhouse gases come from burning fossil fuels to power these vehicles. And the pandemic has obviously limited our transportability massively, with restrictions on international travel, working from home, taking out people's commutes, and people having to just stay at home in general, not being able to go even on, local car journeys. But we have also seen with the pandemic an increased reliance on private vehicles because of reluctance to take public transport, because of heightened risk. So it's been a really interesting time to kind of step back and look at the transport industry, and coming out of the pandemic, how we can kind of work together to make it less bad going forward. And I think sorry, you go.
Also, just a quick point there. So saying that maybe emissions have reduced slightly over the pandemic with everyone being at home, but a permanent lockdown isn't sustainable. I think we need to work on making the transport industry as a whole more sustainable, because we can't realistically ask people to stay at home all the time.
Yeah. No, we absolutely can't. And obviously the kind of key individual actions that I think, again, we do all know about are increasing your reliance on public transport over private vehicles when it is safe to do so. a bus, a train. These are vehicles that are making these journeys anyway, so you might as well be on them rather than driving your own car, because 30 people on a bus means 30 cars off the road. And obviously walking and cycling you're not burning fossil fuels when you go on a walk. So that is obviously the priority where possible, where safe to do so, where you are able. Basically reducing your reliance on any kind of vehicle that burns fossil fuels is a really, really easy thing that you can do on your own to lower your carbon footprint. So those ones that we've spoken about are sort of almost day-to-day things you can do, but there are other individual actions that you can't necessarily do every day but are still equally important.
And the one that springs to mind when you mention something like that is voting power. And it's also one I think is actually quite important to talk about because, just speaking from personal experience over the last, how long has it been? Over the last kind of 4 years or so, a lot of my, and I'm not going to get political here, but a lot of my kind of things that I have believed in and voted for haven't quite been realised in the way that I wanted them to be. As an individual and part of a democratic society, that hasn't happened. And so I know I felt quite disheartened quite often, actually, because it feels like, my voice is not being heard. And so I think it is important to recognise that can be quite disheartening, but you can't let that, you can't let that knock you down, and you can't let that disheartenment impact whether or not you vote in the future, because we must use our democratic right to exercise your voice and your vote, and you've got to do that to support people and, in Britain, to support political parties and then on people who are climate conscious and who espouse sustainable and intersectional environmental practices. And I think, the environment is, for me, as someone who kind of, studies a broadly environmental science, themed field, it's probably the first thing on my mind at a polling station. And we're going to talk about that later on because of the power governments have to enact systemic change. But you can't talk about government and systemic change without talking about the importance of voting at the individual level. And I think, in a democratic society, which we're very fortunate and very privileged to live in, individuals should inform the government. And that should be the way the process works. And therefore, it is your moral obligation to vote in political candidates who will listen to the voice of the people and heed their views on climate change, as opposed to a candidate who might espouse short-term economic prosperity at the expense of long-term environmental security. So we are going to talk about government and systemic power later on, but we can't talk about that without mentioning in this individual action-themed segment the importance of voting power. So even if you do feel that it's pointless, they're never going to take notice, well, the more times you vote like that and the more times you get your friends to vote like that and have that conversation, then the more likely it is that people will take notice. So I think that's the big thing for me at the minute is voting power. And we have seen recently a couple of positive examples of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, as a conservationist, I often think arguably the most important thing you can do as an individual is vote. And it's important to vote based on your own values, your own opinions. And we're obviously not going to sit here and tell you who to vote for. But considering the environment at the polling stations is a massive, massive thing that can really help.
And I think it's one of those things as well, if you feel disheartened that you as an individual can't change anything, just think of the voting system. That is how it works. It's loads of individuals coming together to bring about electing a party or a person who represents your views. So if you feel like you don't matter, multiply that by however many billion people are voting, and then you do make a difference.
And I think
definitely.
you make a really good point. We're not going to sit here and tell you who to vote for, obviously, because we're an environmental and zoological podcast, not a political one. However, and everyone is entitled to their own beliefs and moral systems of judgment and everything. However, I would say that given the state of the planet at the moment, I would like to believe that environmental and sustainable policies actually should, at the very least, transcend your moral and political compass and should transcend political party and boundaries and ideology and philosophy. I know that a lot of the times it doesn't, and I know realistically it's quite a polarized political issue, for a lot of very valid reasons, and for a lot of people it is. But in my heart, I quite firmly believe that this is something that because it affects every single human being on the planet, it must be an apolitical issue. It's not, but
Well, I hope what's becoming clear through this episode and through part 1, and will become more clear through the rest of part 2, is that the climate crisis has kind of impacted and is found in every aspect of society. And so I do, obviously I have a complete bias because I work in this field, but it is my, my number one issue when I vote, and that it is because the environment and the climate crisis especially affect every other aspect that you would vote on. They affect our economy, they affect our social systems, they affect our schools, they affect our food. For every aspect of government, our healthcare systems are going to be heavily impacted by the climate crisis. And so if you are, it makes sense to vote on this issue because it affects every other issue.
And a point we made in the previous podcast on that, which just, if you haven't seen it, you might find quite interesting. We were talking about migration. And so if for whatever reason you don't support migration into, so we're Europeans, I'm going to talk about Europe. If you don't support migration into Europe, then you really should be really hot on climate issues, because climate, the environmental crisis will make the migration movement will make human migration worse and will increase its scale. So I think a lot of the time you might think, and I think our side of the argument is quite guilty of this, of polarizing this issue itself. But no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, and no matter what your opinions are, it will affect you, and therefore I think you should be very, 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 very invested in voting for environmental policies. But what I really liked then when you said that it kind of permeates everything. Every aspect of our society will be impacted by this, and so I guess the next individual action to talk about is how we can be more sustainable in maybe our fashion choices and our clothing practices.
Yeah, I think people are often quite surprised at the environmental impact of the fashion industry. And largely we're talking about fast fashion. So fast fashion is it's inexpensive clothes being produced rapidly by mass market retailers to meet demands of the latest trends. And that's kind of why it's called fast, because the fashion market is always changing. So brands are constantly having to keep up by continually producing new products for the mass market. And this translates to roughly 80 to 100 billion items of clothing being produced every year.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
And put it in perspective, there's only about 7 billion people on the planet.
Exactly. So for all of those items to be given a home, every single person in the world would need to buy 10 to 13 items every year. Now, some people listening to this podcast might well do that, but if you think about all the people on the planet who don't even have access to clean water, there's no way that every single person on the planet is buying 10 to 13 items of clothing every year. So it's just crazy. So this kind of mass production means that the fashion industry generates about 4% of all global waste, which again is massive for one industry to occupy 4%. And that's about 92 million tons. Which again, these are just numbers that you can't even even picture in my head. And a report by the Global Fashion Agenda in 2017 found that the fashion industry is responsible for the emissions of 1.715 millions of tons of carbon dioxide, which is about 4.3% of global carbon emissions. So
that's a lot.
That's very significant when you're talking about emissions.
It is, yeah. I think considering, there's 100 100% available, for one just to be taken by a single industry is crazy, but 4.3 to go to the fashion industry, when you think about a quarter is going to food, a quarter is going to transport, and then 4 is going to clothes. Like, it's just kind of mad. So in terms of individual action, as we have fast fashion, we have slow fashion. So the slow fashion movement basically promotes fashion which is much lower in waste and carbon emissions. It's often also called sustainable fashion. So some ways in which to shop sustainably in terms of fashion are to buy secondhand clothes, to support charity shops, or use apps like Depop or Vinted, or to just, sell clothes to people or give clothes to your friends, because then you're not supporting these fast fashion brands again. You're not investing in these brands that are generating waste. You are reusing your clothes by passing them on to other people. Or obviously, you can donate them to, as I said, charity shops. You can also support sustainable fashion brands. So you can create clothes in a sustainable way. So these tend to use recycled materials, or they make clothes to order, so that minimises waste. And they locally produce their clothes as well to minimise their transport emissions, or they use renewable energy powered factories. So again, as you're kind of seeing, all these things are interlinked. The transport industry has high emissions, so reducing your reliance on it helps make your product more sustainable. So supporting kind of sustainable brands also shifts the market away from fast fashion and towards sort of slow fashion. Other things just include things like mending your broken clothes. Don't be so quick to throw stuff away. Shop local, minimises transport. Swap clothes with your friends. Donate your clothes. And also just, stop buying new clothes if you don't need them. The most sustainable choice is to buy nothing. The most sustainable thing you can buy is nothing. And you really, obviously we need clothes. You have to wear clothes to go outside, really. But you do only need to buy what you need. And this we've all been sort of tricked into this constant changing trends that we always have to buy new things, but you don't. If you look good, that's fine. You can stick in what you're wearing. So, avoiding buying clothes as much as you can is also a really sustainable choice.
I think I like this kind of theme that we're kind of going for here. Like, ultra fast food is really, really bad. This ultra consumerist food philosophy is bad, and just kind of cutting down is good. And it's like the same can apply for fashion, I think.
Also, I don't know if this is a bit of a tenuous link, but also I think the fast fashion industry has so much to answer for in terms of people feeling like they continuously need to replace their clothes to feel validated. It's this external validation that you get in society, that it's all about appearance and how you look and what brands you're wearing, which is people are trying to keep up with this impossible mental game to meet these standards, say, of celebrities or the fashion industry. And it's like, if you go to the charity shop and buy something you feel comfy in, you feel happy in, it makes you feel good, that is so much more important. It's self-empowering rather than looking to the outside to tell you that you look good in your latest branded clothing. Like, I think it's all linked as well with that in society.
And I think a nice way, maybe, well, I say a nice way, this is very much a me viewpoint, because as you may have guessed, I'm not a big fan of social media. I think, and we talked about this a lot in the exotic pets episode, but I think a way forward actually for tackling fast fashion might be getting, I don't know how you do this, because it's quite restrictive, and but I guess maybe, some legislation which limits the amount of promotion by, rapid fashion trends on social media. I don't know is that just really authoritarian? It might be, but you know what I mean? Like, we need to tackle fast fashion as a separate issue, but I also think we need to tackle the way we view fast fashion in society, and so much of that kind of bubbles out of social media, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think, but also on the flip side of that, it's very hard to judge what is actually sustainable or not, because you've got all these companies who are marketing these sustainable t-shirts and asking people to be ambassadors, and I actually signed up for one and then backed out because it was this American company and they were going to have to fly the t-shirt halfway across the world for me to be an ambassador to model this sustainable t-shirt, and I'm like, wait, how is this linking in with sustainable? And they just kept really pestering me, and I'm like, okay, this is obviously like something that's a scam. But it's this massive marketing it as sustainable. Whereas, like you were saying, Kate, if you can swap clothes with your friends or go to charity shops, then you actually know that it's sort of less energy and production into it if you're reusing clothes rather than buying new.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely.
And I think if we can, it's interesting that pops up, the tackling it on the social level, because that leads into the internet. which is something we're going to talk about now. I think it's maybe the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of individual action against climate change. And I don't know how much of this is action and how much of this is just something to be aware of, because I know we were all quite shocked when we started researching this.
Yeah, I feel like this is one that is never talked about. Like, it was very, very recently that I found out about the greenhouse gas emissions of the internet. So basically, I think it's the scale of it is the problem, like most things with human beings. So there are an estimated 4.1 billion people connected to the internet. Again, this is obviously divided across the world. Not everyone has access to it. And the internet's energy and carbon footprints are actually estimated to exceed those of air travel.
Whoa.
And so just another shocking fact, which I was wowed by, is that the IT industry's greenhouse gas emissions are predicted to reach 14% of global emissions by 2040.
So where is all that coming from? Because obviously we're on the internet now having this conversation. I can't see any carbon dioxide coming out of my laptop. How is the? I mean, I wouldn't know. Carbon dioxide's invisible, but that's worrying. Why? Where is it coming from? Because I've never thought about it before.
I think it's a hard one to get your head around because it's invisible and you can't picture it. But basically, it's from kind of all stages, like with the food system of. So you've got the manufacturing and the shipping. So shipping their products all around the world and their servers and databases and things like that. But also a significant part of this is powering and cooling. So in order to power these databases and get information from different things, so the internet is this mass global system, you're getting loads of information from all these databases. And to generate this energy to power and cool these massive systems is using energy predominantly from fossil fuels, so coal, natural gas and petroleum.
So
I
it's
imagine
the servers.
If we have a kind of shift towards renewable electricity, the greenhouse gas emissions of the internet would also decrease because it's almost the reliance on electricity.
I think that would make a huge difference and big companies are moving towards that, because as an individual, yes, you can limit the amount of usage and time you spend on the internet and what you do. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But if these big companies switch to renewables, we wouldn't have as much of a problem.
I guess it does make sense because the internet, I think we all forget this, I definitely do, that the internet is a product like any other. Because I know this might sound a bit crazy, but I always think of the internet as something that was discovered rather than invented, because I can't picture it as an entity. So I'm like, oh, it was always there, and then we just sort of found it and realised how to kind of hack into it. But of course, actually, it was invented. So it's a product.
I always kind of thought, an apple fell on Tim Berners-Lee's head, and he's like, oh my god, the internet.
I found it. It's here. Kind of, and all products, as all people do, have carbon footprints.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And
are there any stats on that? Are there any stats on the scale of this?
Yeah, so I'll give you some stats, because I was, again, just probably sat there with my mouth open doing research, looking like an idiot, because I'm like, how did I not know this?
This is really going to traumatise me. I'm never going to be able to send an email again.
I know, I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed with this, but it's little things I think you can do with the internet rather than get overwhelmed by the scale of it all. So basically, the idea is, so if we as individuals use a search engine, there's an output of greenhouse gases because every unique search engine requires all these servers which are powered by fossil fuels. So if you look at a web page that's got pictures or videos, that emits an estimated 0.2 grams of carbon dioxide per second. So kind of try and put this into perspective a bit, because that might not mean much to people. So one Google search accounts for an estimated 0.2 to 7 grams of carbon dioxide emissions. And so 7 grams is the equivalent of boiling a pot of tea, or like boiling the kettle, for example, or driving the car about 16 meters. So that's one Google search is the equivalent of driving your car 16 meters.
Okay, I'm going to hang up.
And then with email attachments as well. So An email has an estimated carbon footprint of 4 grams of carbon dioxide, whereas if you send a large attachment, that could go all the way up to 50 grams.
Oh my god, we
of
spend most
carbon
of our day
dioxide.
retransferring these massive audio
I
files.
know. I was like, oh my god, what are we doing? But so there are some positive steps, I think. So you might feel overwhelmed by that. I definitely did, and I want to look into it more. But basically, these big companies, this comes into the company side more, but like Apple, Facebook, Google, they've set a goal of powering all their databases with 100% renewable energy moving forwards into the future, because I think they've realised that how big of a problem this is. But maybe to talk about what you can do, so this is the individual section, you could limit the number of emails you send. So maybe, as polite as it is to send just a thank you email to someone, maybe just don't. Just limit the unnecessary.
Fine by me. That's totally fine.
And then apparently replying all uses more carbon. It produces more emissions than just replying directly to someone. You can unsubscribe from newsletters. Like I get a lot of junk mail, which I'm going to unsubscribe from because you don't need it. And then apparently, so this is when my head is not very techy, but there are apparently these green, like when you store data in a cloud. I don't really know what that means.
Me neither.
But there are
I
apparently
assume it's something that's there.
It's like, in some kind of tech space.
Can you tell we're not tech people doing this podcast?
I'm really sorry if I'm butchering all this tech info. But basically there are some green cloud providers. So the cloud already has some completely renewable energy sources. So that's something to look into.
These clouds are like blue at the minute. They're like a little grey. So I don't know how that stacks up in terms of carbon.
Technology's a bit over our heads. But other things you can do, so you can power down your computers, especially if you're away for more than 2 hours, like completely shut down rather than just sleep. And then also at the wall, if you switch off the socket, that's what's called vampire power.
I do that.
Actually,
I do that all the time because I'm slightly OCD and I hate seeing switches on when there's nothing in them. But
yeah, me too.
No, but that's vitally important because I didn't realise that, but it continues to sort of drain energy even if you've just got that switch on. And then another kind of shocking one, I guess, because if, like we talked about this, the video platforms streaming, that kind of thing, emitting large amounts of things. So the pornography industry and these platforms online generates as much carbon dioxide as Belgium does in a year.
As if pornography industry wasn't bad enough.
That's outrageous.
Like, yes, already we have big issues with the pornography industry and its portrayal of sex and women and all that stuff, but the fact that it then emits as much carbon dioxide as Belgium, I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I wonder if Belgium knows that they're being compared in this.
Probably. I feel like no. And then, so again, with those streaming kind of platforms, so we all have probably heard the song Despacito, and so there was 5 billion plays on that single video, and that is estimated to have consumed as much electricity as Chad, Guinea-Bissau, Somalia, Sierra Leone, and the Central African Republic put together in a single year.
Wow.
Just from those 5 billion plays that were clocked on this video. So
just highlights the inequality as well so badly.
Because I bet that wouldn't even be a dent in somewhere like the US.
Yeah.
So maybe you've realised we've talked a lot about videos. So videos are particularly bad, those kind of high data usage platforms. So if you're streaming music, for example, streaming audio is better than just watching videos, for example.
Hey,
and so
listen to a podcast. Shout out to our Spotify listeners.
I guess that's something to mention, that with Biome, possibly something like the website or the Spotify is maybe a more sustainable way to listen. But then it's hard because we're trying to educate people and tell people about this. So I think we're in a bit of a dilemma with...
I think an important kind of... I think something that has come out through talking about all these individual actions is that we obviously know you have to in a modern society, you have to use the internet. You definitely have to buy clothes. Outside of a lockdown, you do have to leave your house, and you are going to exhibit a carbon footprint. And I think one thing with the internet especially is, and with the fashion industry actually, is just be more conscious about what you consume. So we're biased, but something like Biome is, I think, a good use of the internet. Education, there's lots of amazing things happening on the internet, not just within the environmental industry, but within kind of the medical industry and just education in general, and the charity industry as well. There's a lot of great stuff to do on the internet. And so if you are going to be using the internet, because realistically you're going to have to, just be bit more picky about what you're going to be consuming. The same with the fashion industry. If you have to buy clothes, be a lot more skeptical and picky about what you buy and who you buy it from.
Yeah, and who you buy it from is an interesting one as well. Like platforms like Ecosia, which is an alternative search engine to Google. They actually, let me get their stats. So they say that they will plant a tree for every 45 seconds that are performed on their search engine. So it's kind of a way of offsetting, but that's something you can do. Maybe instead of using Google, use Ecosia.
So hopefully that kind of run through of these varied individual actions to combat climate change, we hope that's kind of, certainly I feel a lot more reassured that some of the actions that I do take in my everyday life and new actions that I will now take do have a difference. And sometimes it is hard, especially with the voting one, and especially with all the reports that come out saying, the planet's on fire, Australia's burning. It can be hard to see how your individual action can make a difference. But hopefully just listening to those stats, on the internet, on fast fashion, on all these things, checking your tyre pressure, they do actually have a tangible impact. Because all these big stats are made up of little ones.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just we wanted to say that we're going to make a sort of mini documentary just documenting in video form what we do, us three, in our day-to-day lives that can make a difference. So hopefully that will help you visualize it as well, what you can do as well.
Yeah, and I think how you just put that, Robi, was lovely, that all these big stats are made up of little ones, which kind of segues us quite nicely to our second tier that we're going to talk about, which is collective group action, collective individuals, because you may think you alone doing these things, what difference does it make? And we're telling you it makes a big difference. But it makes an even bigger difference if we all do it together. So we're now going to talk about collective action and collective individuals and what they can do or what we can do to combat climate.
So yeah, I think when it comes to collective action, we can talk about sort of just groups of people. So it can be households and it can be all the way up to thousands of people coming together. So in terms of maybe in a household, things you can do. So there's a really cool toilet paper company called Who Gives a Crap.
We use them.
We used them last year. They're really, really good. And so just, recyclable, made of sustainable packaging, and actually 50% of their products go towards sanitation projects, so water aid in the developing world.
Oh, that's excellent. I didn't know that about Who Gives a Crap, but now I feel even better about using Who Gives a Crap when we're at uni.
Yeah, and you can deliver straight to your door. They do it here in the UK. So that's something you could do as a household, which is really positive. And then you can also switch your energy providers as well. That's a huge difference at a household level. So our house currently here is powered by Ecotricity, and it comes from 100% renewable sources. And it's not that much difference in price, just it's worth looking into where the energy in your home is coming from. And then kind of like we mentioned with the transport thing already, but if you are using cars collectively, as lots of people, you can decide to car share. You can decide, are short journeys necessary in a car? Maybe it's better to come together with lots of people. But so that's kind of smaller groups of people, maybe more in just your house. Do you want to talk a bit more, Kate, about like kind of mass scale people, like more in the hundreds and the thousands?
Yeah, I think we can't talk about collective action in relation to climate change without talking about protests and grassroots movements. And grassroots movement throughout history on a range of social issues have ignited change. We've seen this with civil rights movements, and we are seeing it today with the climate movement. People like Extinction Rebellion, Futures for Fridays, these big movements that ignite hundreds of thousands of people every year to take to the streets and demand action on climate change. And obviously we have to mention Greta Thunberg. She is a kind of global icon at this point, and she is one individual, but she ignited a global movement and has thousands of people following and supporting her, and that has helped ignite change. You know, the protests in London in 2019 led to the government declaring a national emergency, and so collective action in terms of protesting is a really, really important aspect of the climate movement.
And I think with the whole climate crisis, it's so easy to feel overwhelmed and kind of that you might feel insignificant and you don't make a difference. You do, but I think you feel that so much when you are part of a protest. I don't know if you guys have been part of protests, like both like Robi and Kate and also our listeners, but you can't really describe it. It's just so invigorating, and you really feel like you're making a difference because you're walking with people of all ages, all races, all walks of life, and what you're united by is this common goal that you want to make a difference. And it's so powerful, I think. And I go home from these protests and I just feel inspired. I'm like, yes, we can do it, and personal actions do matter. So I think even for that, it's just that empowerment feeling.
That itself is quite an interesting note. So we will come back to that a bit later on when we talk about the importance of intersectionality in, you know, your lifestyle and things. So, you know, I've been on a couple of protests, and I always feel quite unnerved on them. It's interesting. I've never actually come out of a protest feeling as you do, feeling invigorated. I always feel really tense. Something about all those people all shouting. I don't know why. So we are going to talk about later on the line intersectionality and how, you know, your environmental practices can all look different, as long as they're having a positive effect. That's kind of the goal there. But yeah, if we've all seen on the news the scale of all these people marching, it is completely incredible. And in terms of like collective action, another really interesting element of that is how you put that spin on then food, and so cooperative food, or reducing the land area we used to form by changing our diets. That's a collective action. If, you know, one person going vegan, for instance, is not actually that helpful. You need a group of people going, because then that forces a national shift in industry and that sort of thing. And, you know, that has a knock-on effect to restoring biodiversity if you change our land usage, things like land sparing, land sharing. And it is possible for a group of individuals to have this really positive effect. So one we've talked about quite a lot in regards to bison reintroduction in the first series of this podcast was the Wildlifepodcast project, which was a collective group of individuals who are, you know, using bison to manage an area of forest, and I think part of it used to be arable land, in, you know, Canterbury, to kind of reinvigorate biodiversity. So these aren't massive systemic issues, and they're not individual issues, they're, you know, groups. And rewilding initiatives are really often characterised by, you know, just groups of volunteers and educators, focusing on the importance of a few keystone species. Global citizen science is really important. Mass surveys and all these things are really important. So yeah, collective action has a really important impact, I think. And you know, we've got a couple of nice. You've got a nice case study for this, haven't you?
Yeah, I really wanted to kind of highlight an example of where collective action has prevented a potential crisis. So in Cape Town in sort of 2018, Cape Town was approaching something called Day Zero, Day Zero was when the taps were going to run dry and the city was effectively going to run out of water due to an ongoing drought that the area was experiencing. The only way to stop Day Zero from happening was through conserving water supplies. So everyone had to conserve their water supplies. So through collective action, everyone reducing their individual water consumption, the taps didn't run dry. So the initiative to kind of conserve water included a kind of across the city, people were limited to how much water they were allowed per day. So it was 50 litres of water per person per day. And they also had an initiative that kind of worked off the idea of public shame. And you could log on to a website and you could see how much water your neighbours were using. So therefore, if they were using too much, so above the kind of recommended levels, people would know about it. And this really incentivized people to stick to the limits to kind of avoid this public embarrassment.
Guilt is a really effective motivator.
Really effective motivator. And I just really like this case study. Obviously, I used to live in Cape Town, which is why I know about it, and it means a lot to me. But it definitely proves that collective action works. And I attended climate protests in Cape Town, and I have to say, I think the emotion felt by the people there is stronger to climate protests I've experienced in the UK, because firstly, you know, African nations are more likely to be impacted by climate change than the UK is. But secondly, because this is a city that has come together and prevented a crisis before, and now they're just saying, you know, we want to do it again. And by the majority of individuals taking the same steps to reduce their water consumption, it translated to overall water consumption levels dropping, which meant that their taps never ran dry. And the same can be done with climate change. If we all reduce our carbon footprints, then there is less carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. So it is really important to think of the kind of how you are part of a wider system of grassroots individual movement that comes together as this collection of people, and it can really, really make a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's quite empowering, not only for individual action, but when you actually start to see the change with collective groups. And then I guess even bigger than that, we can talk about our next kind of tier, which is looking more at sort of the company or corporate level and kind of their involvement in combating climate change. Because they are they're not the big guys, that's kind of the government, but they still, I think it's important that individuals put pressure on these kind of systems, because then we can get change.
Especially considering a lot of them think they are and act like the big guys. And if you're going to act like it, you should have responsibility for it.
In some ways, they really are. You know, we live in a capitalist society that puts an awful lot of emphasis on the importance of economic growth. Whether you agree with that or not, that is the reality of the situation. And so private companies have a huge amount of wealth and influence.
I think a really nice way, I mean, I completely believe that big companies and big corporations should take a level of responsibility proportionate to the size of their impact and the size of their corporation. My firm belief is that, you know, one individual has the responsibility for themselves and that individual. And if you've got a company with 10 people in, that has 10 times that responsibility. And so a massive global company like Amazon should have a massive global responsibility proportionate to their size and the impact they have. And I think that I think maybe one really nice or quite an accessible way for these big corporations to take perhaps a first step, I don't know if you agree if they've already taken that first step, would be making their industry more transparent and sustainable for the consumer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a good kind of example of that is supermarkets, which are considered like these big corporations. And sort of efforts that they could take, I think, could have a huge impact on individual choices, and vice versa, individual choices also impact the company. So what supermarkets are looking to do currently is kind of maybe develop what's known as a traffic light system on their products. So this would be where you'd get a red, amber or green sort of label on a food product, which would then allow the consumer to make a choice about what they're buying and if that's environmentally sustainable. So the idea of red would be have probably high carbon emissions, less sustainable, and something green would be more sustainable. And so there are already apps in place that are kind of helping consumers with this. So apps like Kogo and Geeky, you can scan barcodes and it sort of helps you as a consumer work towards a net zero sort of emissions. But if people are putting pressures on these supermarkets and these supermarkets change, then that would have a huge impact, I think. And also just in the supermarket system, working towards like not having vegetables in plastic, reducing their food waste. There's already supermarkets across Europe especially that have these refill stations where you just take your own containers. Like, change is happening, and I think it's all this cycle. It's fueled by the people, but big companies are starting to change. But it's not just supermarkets, is it? There's quite a lot of change just in agriculture as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I firmly believe that if you can overhaul agriculture, whether it's arable or livestock, then I kind of think we're halfway there with climate change. I don't know. Maybe that's my preoccupation with, I think there needs to be a lot of change in this system. Maybe I'm over-exaggerating, but I firmly believe that, if we can solve agriculture and reduce its carbon impact and make it the most efficient we can, I think, We're halfway there. One I really, really like, and okay, quick disclaimer, there's a lot to talk about agriculture. I went on a massive tangent, so I'm going to do it very, very quickly. Each of these fully deserves you to go and research them on your own. I hope you all do this. It's really fascinating. So I'm going to go through a quick few bullet points of how we could give agriculture a more environmentally sustainable revamp to keep up with the changing times. So the first one, my favourite, vertical farming. We're going to show you a picture now. This is vertical farming. So it's the practice of growing crops in stacked layers. And so it's like a closed system kind of thing. And it's soilless farming. So you might have, for instance, a skyscraper. And you'd stack the plants inside. You might use a hydroponics or an aquaponics system to keep them growing. And so basically what you do, you maximize production because it's a controlled system. You don't have to worry about weather variations or pests or whatever. You maximize production whilst minimizing the area of land. So if you think about it, if you've got 4 fields, each of which is a mile squared, that means you've got 4 miles squared of land, I hope that's right. I think that's how that works. Anyway, which means you've got 4 miles square of land, and maybe that's all you can do because there's a train line to one side and there's a barn to the other. But if you took those 4 fields and stacked them artificially one on top of the other, you could go on till 16 fields, and you can have 16 fields worth of production in the land area of just one field. So I think vertical farming is an incredibly potent way to maximize our production whilst minimizing the amount of land we use for agriculture.
And I think it can bring farming and agriculture back to cities, because I think people have become very disconnected from where their food comes from and how it's grown. So if you have this vertical farming in cities, I think that's very positive as well. And
bouncing off of COVID, if we start having a load of free office space because people still want to work from home instead, we could very easily turn these offices into vertical farms. There is a disadvantage to this. It's not a blanket solution because there's large startup costs and very high energy demands. If you think of it, you've got a whole building filled with LED trays and hydroponics and aquaponics. If non-renewable energy is used to meet those demands, then you risk having a higher carbon footprint than a normal farm. However,
I guess it's very controlled. I would say
there'd be no waste.
That's a counter argument, is that it's the amount of water is very controlled. It's not wasting anything, whereas in farms, like, vast amounts of pesticides are used, which you wouldn't actually need if you did it like controlled for the individual plant.
You're absolutely right, and the waste would be so much less. A couple of other systems which I kind of mentioned in relation to vertical farming are hydroponics, which is growing plants without soil. So essentially you've got the plant and its roots are suspended in a nutrient solution. Again, a closed system. You'd have it in a building, very climate controlled, pest controlled, LED lights. And one study compared to conventional farming, hydroponics was modelled to increase yield per area of lettuce by around 11 times while requiring 13 times less water. So
that is not that's not a measurement we hear enough.
I think we should measure things in quantities of lettuce.
I mean, we used Belgium before. Let's use lettuce now. Aquaponics is another very interesting system which I think has the potential to revolutionise agriculture. So again, it's a closed system integrating the growth of terrestrial plants with fish. So you have a tank full of fish. The nutrient-rich wastewater from the fish is then filtered by a solid removal unit, passed through a biofilter, which changes the toxic ammonia into nutritious nitrate. The plants absorb the nitrate and purify the water, which goes back into the fish tanks. It's a lovely cycle.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, the plants would also consume the carbon dioxide. The water in the fish tanks maintains the temperature. A very nice, low waste, low carbon, closed system. And, there's a load of them in terms of current agricultural processes. We know the importance of hedgerows and forest patches, so keeping them in. They provide linear landscape elements for the flow of wildlife. They reduce erosion. Hedges are amazing. We could do a whole podcast on hedges.
I think hedges deserve their own podcast.
The last one, this is the last of these agricultural bullet points. I'm darting through them really quickly, but you really should all read about them. They're fantastic. And actually, this is something you mentioned, Emma, never leaving fields bare as carbon leaches. So a lot of the time, fields are left bare after they've been harvested for quite significant periods of the year. I'm sure we've all driven down the motorway and looked, and there's just bare earth. And soil scientists have discovered that this actually acts as a carbon leach, releasing vast quantities of carbon dioxide, which had previously been locked in the ground either as biomass or as soil. But where fields have plants growing in them, they act as carbon sinks, drawing the carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and locking it away underground. So if you've got, a farm which is harvesting wheat for half the year and leaving it bare for the rest of the year, a perennial crop like alfalfa, which is economically important, could just be sown in those times when the main crop isn't growing. And so that's, a really quick overhaul of agriculture.
I think just last point on the agriculture thing. So especially like you're saying with that leaving the soils bare, I think kind of what's emerging now is this field of regenerative agriculture, which is looking at things like this. So keeping crop cover over these bare soils, making sure that the nutrients cycle back into the earth, and also using grazers, so things like either bison or certain species of cattle, to then trample certain areas of land to cycle the nutrients. So that, I think, is kind of emerging as the way that farms are moving to be more sustainable, kind of conventional farming systems, but making it cyclical so that it's all contained. I think that has a lot of promise as well in the future.
And so, that was a really quick overview of how we might consider rehauling agriculture. Again, there's a whole podcast series there. Perhaps what I didn't talk about there is reforestation and, afforesting areas where it's previously been deforested. Because I think that's a new point in itself, isn't it? Carbon offsetting through reforestation.
Yeah, I think that's something that's emerging, and also has emerged with quite a lot of controversy as well. The idea that possibly big corporations and governments are just offsetting the amount of carbon that they produce by being like, it's okay, we plant this many trees a year so we can continue to burn fossil fuels and be really unsustainable because we've planted all these trees. But it can be used in a very positive way. So an example of this is Costa Rica. So they offered grants to landowners to replant these native trees, and in 25 years, forests have recovered to cover half of Costa Rica. So this shows that if you have these big, sort of collective, large company actions, even towards the government level, that you can restore huge amounts of forests, which is, again, a massive ally in the fight against climate change.
I mean, my kind of view at the moment is that perhaps reforestation and carbon offsetting through reforestation might best be undertaken at the government level. I feel, I don't know, I haven't researched this enough, but I do feel a bit wary of when companies carbon offset, because it does feel a little bit like that's not actually a solution, that's just good marketing sometimes.
Yeah, I feel like if you're going to do it right, it has to involve the local people, it has to actually benefit kind of the people living on this land as well. And a really good example of that is what's called the Green Wall in the Sahara Desert. So like we talked about, the Great Green Wall.
It's great.
Yeah,
I think
even
it's a
better.
great green wall. Yeah.
Even better. And so like we talked about in part 1, this idea of the Sahara advancing, areas becoming more desertified, this project is basically aiming to halt the advance of the Sahara Desert. And the aim is to plant 1 billion trees, so these drought-resistant trees, things like acacia, and this idea that this wall of trees would keep the soil in place, it would stop the desert expanding, basically, and they've seen really positive effects. So wells have started to fill up in local communities because if you've got more water held in the soil, they can then sell the food and stuff. If they're crop trees, that's extra income for the local people. So I think initiatives like that are very, very positive. And I guess some more high-techy stuff that is going on with this sort of thing. There's the Global Airborne Observatory. So basically what they did, they fly over the forest canopy and fire these high-powered lasers at the trees.
What?
And, yeah.
Who woke up one morning and applied for a grant to do that? I'd love to see that grant proposal, like, I need a helicopter and a really big laser and I'm going to fly over the Amazon.
Yeah, it's, I mean, genius, but bonkers. But the idea that basically once you fire these lasers at the trees, it gives you this map and it shows you how much carbon is actually stored within each tree. So it can tell you how valuable that section of forest is in terms of acting as a carbon storage, which is pretty cool.
That's so cool.
And then I guess linking that in, so with the idea of trees and afforesting, there's a really, really cool project to reforest a big section of the Amazon, which is looking to plant over 73 million trees. So it's, I think, the largest kind of initiative there is to reforest this area of the forest. Yeah, so it's a big initiative aiming to plant 73 million trees. And what's really interesting about this is that they're working with indigenous communities who have a unique knowledge of seeds. So basically what they did, they harvested all these different seed types. So I think it was about 200 different tree species of the most important trees in this area. And they mixed it into this like huge seed mixing bag, which they then went and sowed on the land. And that would be enough to actually regenerate a healthy, diverse rainforest. And they wouldn't have been able to do that without the indigenous knowledge of the seeds.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I have to say, carbon offsetting I'm quite sceptical of. But I think reforestation I'm all in favour of. There's kind of two kind of key points with carbon offsetting that I find slightly problematic. And the first one is kind of, as you guys have mentioned, I don't see it as a solution at all. I think it's more concealing or covering up the problem, and that's still better than nothing. So I'm not completely anti-offsetting, but I think, for example, when you can offset your flights, or when private companies offset, or even governments offset their own emissions, the more sustainable choice is to cut your emissions rather than to do your emissions and then offset them. Even if you 100% offset them, it would be more sustainable to not have done that in the first place. And often the offsetting isn't happening at the same site as the emissions. So a lot of Western countries offset their carbon in South America and Africa. But that means that you're still releasing carbon in the Northern Hemisphere and offsetting it in the Southern Hemisphere. So the balance isn't exactly right. The second issue is not all reforestation projects are good. Emma's just highlighted some really great ones, especially that Amazon one, and the importance of working with indigenous people beyond the fact that that's morally the only way you should be doing these projects, and the kind of obvious social impacts are the indigenous people's knowledge is unrivaled. And that's something that I think was forgotten in conservation in the past and is being relearnt. And it's really important when you're reforesting an area to make sure you're planting the right trees. And some reforestation projects just plant trees and they don't think about what would be the best trees to plant in that area. And you make sure you're really, really important to make sure you're implanting indigenous species and not invasive species. So when you're offsetting your carbon or supporting a tree planting project, just make sure they're working with local people and they are planting the right species. One I really recommend, and this is a bit of a jump back to individual action, but there's an app called Tree App, and I really recommend downloading it. You just have to click through ads, less than a minute of ads once a day, and then you can plant a tree in different countries. So the app is fully funded by sponsorships with these companies that pay for the ads, and you just click through them like you would on YouTube. It takes 30 seconds and then you can plant a tree, and they're all indigenous projects, they're all community-based management, so it's a really nice thing you can do to kind of offset your own carbon emissions. So I'm not completely against offsetting, but I am slightly skeptical of it, and I just think you have to be really, really careful about which projects you choose to support.
My feeling on offsetting has always been that's the very least you should be doing.
Yeah,
I
agree.
You should be doing that anyway.
Yeah.
What else are you doing?
Yeah, I think the problem with offsetting is it makes people feel too comfortable.
Yeah.
I'm booking this flight, but I've offset it, so therefore this flight doesn't have a carbon footprint, and it's like no. it still has the carbon footprint. Like, well done for offsetting it. That's good. It's better than not offsetting it, as long as you're offsetting it with an appropriate project. But yes, I agree. It's not. Yes.
So, having talked about all these big companies, what do we think? How much does the responsibility to tackle climate change fall to the business, industrial, corporate sector? Big companies, Apple, Amazon. I think, I've already kind of said my view. I think it should be proportional to the impact that they have.
I agree with that, but I do think they have a huge responsibility to tackle climate change, and I think it's completely hypocritical for them to expect individuals to take any individual action if they are not taking the action themselves. I think the power of these companies is something that we don't fully understand because it doesn't really make sense, and the law has kind of struggled to keep up with a lot of these companies with a lot of technology we have, and then stuff always comes out that we had no idea was going on, and the power and influence these companies have is astronomical, and therefore I think they have a huge responsibility. And they're also massive contributors to the climate crisis. So 100 companies, 100 of kind of the world's biggest companies, are responsible for about 71% of global emissions. So these are the big guys.
The big guys.
Big bad guys.
Big and scary. And we really do need to put pressure on to shift their investment to fossil fuels into sustainable alternatives.
It would be really interesting, just on that 100 big companies, it'd be really interesting. Is that a big 100 oil companies? Or is that, are some of those fashion companies? Are some of those food production companies? Is it mining and palm oil? It'd be interesting to see that breakdown of what their investments are. I don't think they'd ever release it, though.
No, I don't have the 100 kind of ranked. I imagine, obviously, the oil companies are going to be up there. I imagine some of the big tech companies will be up there because they are some of the biggest companies in the world. But yeah, that would be an industry breakdown. In 2018, the commercial sector was responsible for 18% of CO2 emissions. So that's the commercial sector. And in the US, industry accounted for more than a fifth of greenhouse gas emissions in the same year, in 2018. And in 2019, the UK Committee on Climate Change said that it will be businesses that primarily deliver the net zero target and provide the vast majority of required investment. And that's the other thing that businesses can do, is they can provide the capital needed to shift and invest in renewable energy versus fossil fuels. Because, we do live in a society that's dictated by money, and so where the money is kind of where the industry follows. And so if those big companies with lots of capital invest in renewable energy, it will be a lot easier for governments to make that a national kind of, I was about to say curriculum.
Commitment.
To make that a national commitment. So I think it's really important that companies and the government kind of stay on the same level as well, and that they, in terms of their targets, and that companies commit to the same targets as nations. So, for example, in the UK, sourcing 100% renewable energy by 2050. If companies are reaching for that, then it will be a lot easier for everyone else to get there too. So I do think a lot of responsibility falls on these big private corporations.
So that's probably quite a nice way to link it in. Let's take this one step further, go even bigger, although in some cases we know, because there is a disparity there, it actually isn't bigger. Governmental, national, international action to combat climate change. How do we... Oh, it's the biggest stage we can get to.
This is the kind of systemic change that we kind of talked about in the title. These are our systems.
So yeah, I think it's hard to, when you get to this top stage of governments, because I think this is ultimately what we're working towards, is systemic change, so that the whole system can become more sustainable. But there was a really interesting study that kind of found that people are more likely to support policies and people in power if they actually advocate for low carbon footprints themselves. So it's this idea of leading by example, which, like you were saying, Robi, I think there is a lot of disheartenment in voting and not seeing that change. And so they've actually found that if the person communicating these policies is leading by example, then more people will actually follow. So it shows how it's all linked. It's the individuals at the top, but it's also the individuals, you and me, everyone listening to this, who can actually force that change. But I guess that's more at an individual level of how we perceive governments and what they're doing. Do we want to talk a bit more about like just bigger reforms, like in the entire economic system?
Yeah, I think this is the one that's the punchy one that people are pushing for, and I agree. It's sort of what we've all been leading up to, and a lot of the kind of collective action we've spoken about, a lot of these protests, what they're asking for is massive in governmental and economic change. And what this means in terms of the climate movement is a kind of shift from a consumerist economy and I guess a capitalist economy to some extent. And that's not us saying down with capitalism entirely. That's not at all what protesters are saying either. But as we've kind of noted, this kind of consumerist society that we live in is racking up a massive carbon footprint, and this idea of things being on demand and that you can buy something and have it here the next day, or you can book a plane ticket and be on that plane tomorrow, that is racking up massive carbon footprints. And this kind of way we can shift away from that comes from an economic reform. Banks, pensions, big companies are investing in and supporting fossil fuels. And this needs to change. We need to move away from investing our capital in fossil fuels into investing our capital in renewable energy. Coming out of the pandemic kind of provides the perfect backdrop for this, because our economy has been completely shattered by this pandemic that was, unprecedented, guys. I don't know if you know. And we didn't, we've had the economic crisis of 2008 and we've been, steadily recovering. We've had economic crisis before, and the pandemic has provided another one. And therefore we have this opportunity to rebuild our economy in a different way, and we could transform it and push for a green recovery. So invest in renewable energy, invest in creating more sustainable jobs, and a blue recovery as well. So recovery for and protecting the oceans. Whether that will happen is yet to be seen. It's not looking great. But this is the kind of the clincher, is we need this massive economic shift away from fossil fuels.
And I think the other big one is, that's the kind of economic argument. I think on the social and moral argument, you've also got improving living standards for people across the world, not just in developing countries, but that's the one that a lot of people have in the forefront of their minds. So I know when we mentioned the agricultural thing on the kind of corporate level, so when I think about the human response to climate change, for me personally, the two biggest factors are reform of the agricultural sector and the improving of living standards for people around the world. So it's projected that there will be 11 billion people by 2100. That's a lot of people.
That's a lot, yeah.
And that is going to have, if we've got a massive carbon impact at 7 billion and we're going to get to 11 billion, we need to somehow either reduce population growth or make sure that for the people who are born, their national economic system gives them a lower carbon impact. And I think the best way to do that is by improving living standards. So lowering birth rates, improving access to healthcare, improving access to clean water and sustainable food resources. These are all fantastic ways to mitigate that. And we've seen, if you look at demographic change as a nation develops, and if you look at Western developed nations, we've seen that as the nations develop, there is a correlation there between a reduction in children, because children go from being an economic positive and a necessity to work in the industrial or the agricultural sector, and then they actually go to being an economic drain as these things become more expensive. And so if you can improve access to these vital resources around the world, and if you can speed up the development of developing countries, then you can actually reduce that birth rate. The key point there being is countries can't all develop in the wasteful way that industrialized Western Europe has. We cut down all our forests for our development. We've got barely any left. And so we need to make sure that development becomes sustainable. The key factor within that, I think, the biggest clincher for me, not for me, what do I know? The biggest clincher is raising people out of poverty, and in particular, women and girls, I think, are the key. The social and sexual emancipation of women and girls is the only true and proven solution to poverty around the world. It's the only one where we have seen uncontroversial results. We've seen Bangladesh in particular springs to mind. So apologies to all the missionaries out there, it don't work. Women and girls are the key. And as important as men are to this process, because, it's an unpleasant fact that men are a lot of the time, a majority of the time, in the positions of power and therefore in the position to make that structural change, over half the population of the planet are women. And the majority of these are not sexually or socially emancipated. And so if you can rectify that, either by education, positive discrimination, promotion of sexual health and contraception, you unlock a vast reservoir of talent. Half the population will be unlocked that potential. I mean, I always think of it, okay, we've put people on the moon and we've got into space, and we did that for, you know, the last 1,000 years of history, where half of our population has been effectively shackled and not been allowed to reach their full potential. Think of what we could achieve. Think of how we could solve the climate crisis if we kind of got the other half of the population into this conversation. Not only is it a moral and ethical right, it is a self-preservation thing, you know, on a purely basic level. And there are statistics, you know, not to mention the fact that women are 14 times more likely to die due to climate-related issues. Again, because across the majority of the world, they are at a lower social level. We will never succeed in this climate fight without women and girls. And so for me, along with agriculture, accepting that at the national level is the most important thing. We need to see that in religious policy, is something I would very much like to see. We need to see that in national policy. There are far too many female leaders at the new summit, which is coming up in Glasgow, which Britain is professing to be a leader in. So, yeah.
Far too few, you mean, right?
What did I say?
Far
oh
too
my God,
many.
no, far too few. There are far too few female faces and leaders at this new COP summit. So yeah, improving living standards through improving access to vital resources, reducing global population growth rate, sustainable development, and women and girls are the key to this. So that is, for me, the most important national and systemic issue in this fight.
And I think also consumption comes into that, because population growth is not the same around the world. So if you consider the amount that someone in a Western world will consume in their lifetime and their children will consume is so much higher than in the developing world in places like sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia. So I think along with population and empowering women and bringing them into this discussion, like you said, Robi, I think we also need to address consumption of the Western world, because increasing population in the West will have a significantly higher impact than increasing population in the developing world.
Absolutely.
So I guess, as well as talking about the people side, bringing people into this, we also have a role, I think, to look back to nature. These governments have a role to look into these systems that could be vital allies in the fight against climate change. So we've already touched on this a bit, but things like you were saying, Kate, with the blue recovery, recovering oceans and sort of implementing no fish zones or marine protected areas, that is something at the government level that they can do to allow healthy oceans to recover, because healthy oceans take up more carbon dioxide. It also means healthier array of marine species. Billions of people rely on coastal industry to support their livelihoods. And oceans also produce up to 70% of the oxygen we breathe. So also very important. So I think that's something that governments can help there. And also, as sad as it is to say this, I think until people realise that there is just an intrinsic value to natural spaces and ecosystems, governments almost have a role to monetize these ecosystems in order to protect them. I don't agree with it. I don't think we need to put a value on a tree to think that it's important. But I think, like we saw in Costa Rica, where landowners were actively how do I say this in English? Monetarily incentivized.
I think so, yeah.
Can I say that? Yeah. To preserve their forests and to plant trees. That comes from the government level, I think, to giving people an incentive to create, recover, and protect these natural spaces. And then with this change, I think governments can also support rewilding initiatives, making sure that ecosystems are biodiverse and productive, and bringing keystone species back in as well. I think we underestimate the role that biodiversity on our planet can. We think we need to solve it all. We think we're the ones who have the answers. Yes, we do, but as the dominant species, we need to draw on all these nature-based solutions, because I actually think yes, beavers. But I feel like looking to nature-based solutions is something we can do as individuals, but also at the government level, because that, is vitally, vitally important. And I guess, I don't know, this is shifting away a bit, but another point that I think is important to make is with legislation and government, they have a huge role in how we build our homes moving into the future. Because currently, new homes are just being built and there's not really much consideration of the materials used, and they're not building them to be sustainable, basically. So energy used in homes in the UK accounts for 20% of UK greenhouse gas emissions. And so 3/4 of that comes from heating and hot water. And so one of the best things we can do to mitigate this is to insulate homes and design them with sustainability in mind. So homes that are insulated use so much less energy to power, basically, and use less greenhouse gas emissions. So whilst we can make changes in our own homes, like we already discussed, I think legislation to build new homes sustainably is important, but also what they're saying is this idea of retrofitting. So taking old homes, which already exist, and putting in effective insulation and triple glazing, things like that, that can be changed even in homes that already exist, and that would have a huge impact, I think, moving forwards.
I think what's really interesting about both those points you just said is the kind of ability of the government to incentivise green movement, and I think that's something that happens in the home as well. So in the UK a few years ago we had a solar panels initiative that was run by the UK government, and they basically made it cheaper to install solar panels onto your house. So that was a financial incentive offered by the government, and then any energy that you generate that you do not use, you sell back to the grid, which is still the case, but the scheme in order to get cheaper solar panels has been discontinued. I don't know why, but I thought that was a brilliant scheme. And again, as Robi mentioned earlier in the episode about electric cars, as the government has made this pledge to take petroleum cars off the road by quite soon. I think it's 2030 that they're saying this. They are incentivizing, offering financial incentives in order for more people to buy electric cars, and that means that they have to make them cheaper. And financial incentives, the power of financial incentives should not be underestimated. And I also think, as much as I agree with you with the intrinsic value of nature, I think when it comes to things like electric cars and solar panels, I think it's brilliant to be offered a financial incentive, because
I'd like one.
People do need...
Can't afford it otherwise.
And people can't afford it, and people cannot be expected, just because the government has said you will need to buy electric cars, the government cannot expect that everyone can just do that, because the vast majority of people are not in the position to do that. And so that's a really key power that the government holds that our other tiers don't hold, is the ability to offer... I guess private companies can within their own company on products, but governments can nationalise these incentives for individuals, which makes it easier for individuals to make a greener choice.
But I think that's a government choice. What they choose to subsidise is very much influenced by what the people are demanding. And so currently they're subsidising things that I think are wrong. So we're subsidising the usage of fossil fuels. We're subsidising the meat and dairy industries. Like there could be a shift away from that at the government level, and that would have a big impact, I think.
And I think about, governments shifting, the big thing they can shift away from, and I think probably the most kind of flashy issue when we talk about this climate change stuff is obviously fossil fuels. So
Definitely.
Just to give a run through of some of the alternative options that governments can shift towards, solar energy. So Morocco has the world's largest concentrated solar plant, which you might have seen it on one of the recent Attenboroughs. I can't remember which one. Was it Life on Our Planet, or was it?
I think, yeah.
Fantastic! It looks like a James Bond lair. So it uses these, and it's a great idea. It's in the middle of the Sahara. Why don't we carpet the Sahara with solar panels? You could power Europe and Africa and Asia and North America, South America, like that. So they use these incredible mirrors to superheat this liquid in this massive tower, which is then the energy from that is stored in molten salt. Isn't that incredible?
didn't even realise that was
I
a
didn't
thing.
know. And then they use that molten salt to power these steam turbines, which can be powered at night when the sun isn't there. And so it runs at, I think, it produces 110 megawatts. And there's an additional 72 megawatt photovoltaic system planned, and so it is already the biggest in the world, and it will get bigger. So one thing I would quite like to see is, okay, well, why don't the British government, sign a land lease deal with, I don't know, Algeria, and say, hi, we want to buy 100 square kilometers of desert, and we want to carpet it with solar panels and molten salt, and we're gonna get that clean energy. I think it's fantastic. Bhutan.
But I think the thing is, if we invested more in these renewables, we could make them even more sustainable. So currently you are using things like precious metals and things to make the batteries for the solar panels. Like, if we just forget the whole fossil fuel conversation, like if we were just focusing on renewables, we could make them even more sustainable than they already are.
And think of the jobs.
Yeah, not to mention, that's the thing. Yeah. If we bought 100 square miles of desert in Algeria and say, hi, we want to turn this into a solar farm, think of the benefit that would bring to Algeria. Jobs, we'd have to rent the land, and they'd have to put the whole thing up. It'd be fantastic. Bhutan is very good on hydropower. Bhutan's largest export is hydroelectricity, and the country has the potential to generate 30,000 megawatts of hydropower. Bhutan is this incredible biocapacity reserve, which means that each individual person has a much lower global carbon impact than the global average. I actually am somewhat skeptical of hydropower, just because of the impact of dams on riverine ecosystems. So the creation of the Three Gorges Dam was a big factor in the extinction of the Chinese river dolphin, the baiji. But nonetheless, it is still reliable, renewable, clean energy, and I think there definitely is a place for it in the world. Staying on Bhutan, they've actually managed to go carbon negative. They have net negative.
Bhutan's so cool.
Net negative greenhouse emissions, because the entire country produces 2,200,000 metric tons of CO2 a year, and Bhutan is carpeted in this fantastic forest. And the forest absorbs more than 4 million tons of CO2 a year. So it's a net negative. And the Kingdom of Bhutan has also got a tenth of all cars are electric, and implemented a plastic bag ban in 2019. So I think we all need to follow Bhutan's example.
And they're, I think, either the happiest or the second happiest country in the entire world. So.
And of course there are other renewable alternatives to fossil fuels that we can focus on. So there's wind. Wind, for example, the Walney wind farm in Britain is one of the largest offshore wind farms in the world. It's sustainable and it is renewable, but it's an intermittent energy source. So the wind doesn't always blow, and it's more regular out to sea than it is on land, but it can't really be dispatched on demand. So it's definitely worth heavily investing in, but it might not be as permanent a solution as something like solar in the Sahara, where it's always sunny. Iceland have done a very cool thing. They've gone on to geothermal energy. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Iceland was one of Europe's poorest countries, because it's got very, very few natural resources. But the one natural resource it does have is unlimited geothermal energy, because Iceland is basically volcanoes. And now nearly 100% of its electricity comes from renewable energy sources. And what I think Iceland have been doing very well, and I think what they should be extremely proud of, is they've partnered with the UN's energy department, UNEP, to spark an energy revolution in Eastern Africa, because obviously you've got the Great African Rift Valley, which is this massive geologically active, strip across East Africa. And they're really heavily investing in, training geothermal engineers in countries like that. So those are kind of the ones that spring to mind immediately. We've also got nuclear, and there's kind of two different types of nuclear. We've got nuclear fission, which is the current energy system, and we've also got nuclear fusion. Emma, do you want to say a little bit about nuclear, just because you might know a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is something very new to me in terms of understanding what nuclear fusion is. I didn't really realise what was going on with it because it hasn't actually been achieved yet, is the issue with nuclear fusion. But with nuclear fission, the current system, there are lots of concerns with sort of the operating costs and also just the radioactive pollution. I think is a big issue, certainly in my mind and a lot of other people's minds as well, as a result of these big incidents that have happened. But nuclear fusion, what this is instead of splitting sort of a nucleus, I think it's sort of the bringing together of energy when you form this nuclear. Like, I need to look into it more, but basically it's more efficient than this fission-based technology, and it doesn't carry the hazardous waste disposal risk associated with it either.
Yeah, sorry for lumping you with nuclear. I'm really bad at chemistry and physics, so I was like, I'm going to get this wrong. Emma, you're smarter than me.
No, but I think it's something I'd recommend you guys look into this more. Because basically, like you said with the wind, Robi, in terms of not being reliable all the time, the amount that could be generated by nuclear fusion, it's constant, it's there all the time, and it could basically power the entire world on this fully almost clean energy. And I think they say they're close in terms of achieving the conditions needed for this reaction. It's so specific and really kind of difficult to achieve, but once they do, I think we might see this energy emerge. Is
the new one the one that happens in the sun?
Yes, so nuclear fusion is the same process that happens in the sun and the stars.
So we want to have a little tiny mini sun in a lab.
It's like creating a mini. In my mind, it kind of looks like a mini Big Bang in this massive reactor.
Oh, that's cool.
And then it's got all these magnets that stabilize it, and then it has the potential for being a clean energy in the future. Science. I think
it's incredibly impressive, all of these like renewable technologies. I think, as you kind of mentioned, some of the issues with some of them, it is important to note that none of these things are perfect. But if you compare the kind of global impact on the planet of renewable energy versus fossil fuels, it's just, it's barely a comparison. They're just leagues ahead, and it really is kind of the most important thing, is moving away from a fossil fuel economy and towards a renewable economy. And the technologies it's just so impressive. That was a really nice kind of little world tour of renewable energy from Robi. And kind of sticking on the international theme, we just want to mention the kind of importance of global alliances within international governments. So the kind of that's fine. The kind of most important and probably the most famous of these global alliances in terms of climate change is the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement has been in and out of the news quite a lot, actually, recently, kind of towards the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, because it was such a big factor of the US election, because Trump kind of famously took America out, which was highly controversial given how big America's carbon footprint is, and Biden just put America back in on day one of his presidency. So we've all heard of the Paris Agreement, but a really kind of quick rundown of what it is and what it means. Basically, countries came together in Paris. It's got nothing to do with Paris, which was a complete mistake on Trump's behalf. It's got nothing to do with Paris. It's just where they met.
Nice city.
And they pledged to keep global average temperatures well below 2 degrees. Above pre-industrial levels. So that's the baseline that they decided to go for, which makes sense because in the Industrial Revolution obviously was kind of the beginning of the fossil fuel economy. So they agreed to do this while pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So the agreement was to stay below 2 and aim ideally for 1.5 degrees rise in global average temperatures. So the UK's kind of section of this was committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050 relative to its 1990 goals. So at the Paris Agreement, all these countries came together and they universally agreed to limit global temperatures. And the kind of action of that was each country left with individual goals of what they needed to do in order to realise this collective goal, if that makes sense. So we hear a lot about 1.5 degree and 2 degree limits, and we just want to really quickly explain what what the difference is and whether it actually matters, this 0.5 degree difference. So basically, with every 1 degree rise in temperature, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more water, more precipitation building up in the clouds, which means more unpredictable and extreme weather events. If we reach 2 degrees instead of 1.5, it's estimated that heat waves would last a third longer, rainstorms would be around a third more intense, sea level rises would be a third higher, and the percentage of tropical coral reefs at risk of severe degradation would be much greater. 1.5 degrees rise in global average temperature, tropical coral reefs stand a chance of adapting and reversing a portion of their die-off. So that 0.5 degree difference makes a huge difference to that specific ecosystem.
It's either we got it or we lose
with
it.
1.5
Yeah, because at 2 degrees,
Yeah,
there's
pretty
no recovery, basically.
Yeah. So 1.5 they have a chance. 2 degrees they don't have a chance. The Mediterranean area is forecasted to have about 9% less fresh water with a 1.5 degree increase. Wheat and soy production is forecasted to increase. Warming is favourable for farming in higher latitudes. So another kind of system where this 0.5 degree really makes a difference is at 1.5 degree increase. Wheat and soy production is forecasted to increase still, but at 2 degrees, it's crop failure predicted.
Such a narrow
so this
band.
0.5 degree,
Yeah.
yeah, it really does make a difference. And that's why the 1.5 is what's being recommended by scientists. And that's what the Paris Agreement is aiming for, but they've sort of accepted this sort of 2 degree as an acceptable upper limit, I suppose. It's important to note that a 0.5 degree average out over the whole world can mean so much more than just a 0.5 degree average in certain locations over certain times of year. So if greenhouse gas emissions stopped overnight, somehow, the concentrations already in the atmosphere would still mean a global rise between 0.5 and 1 degree Celsius. And an average increase of 1 degree across the entire surface means huge changes in climatic extremes. And the effects of these will be felt most by poorer countries living near the equator. So there's also a really big inequality, which is why it's really important for international cooperation at this level, because the problem is being caused more by certain countries and felt more by others. And so international cooperation is really, really important.
So I think that just highlights that's why I think they didn't say aim for 2 degrees, because if we aim for 2 and then hit 2.5, you're talking the loss of entire ecosystems beyond recovery. Whereas if we aim for 1.5, there is that slight buffer, but you highlighted, Kate, that 0.5 degrees Celsius makes such a big impact. So that's when it comes in that individuals, bigger companies, governments all have a role to play. We can't just be complacent here and be like, it's 0.5 degrees, it doesn't matter, because it does.
So I think the Paris Agreement is obviously really important and a really nice way to kind of end the final tier, the government, national and international actions of governments. So we're kind of just gonna, for the last segment of this podcast, just discuss some of the links between these 4 tiers, because as you may have picked up, they are, all important, but they are also heavily linked to one another. So, Emma, do you want to kind of talk about how individuals are linked to the government?
Yes, I think as you've seen, it's all linked. Individuals do have an impact, especially when informing the government. Like you were saying, Robi, going back to that voting power, it is important. So, if individual action can have real measurable impacts, and just look at the movement that Greta Thunberg has started. So she's a single individual and she's drawn attention to the climate crisis. She's got people talking about it, and here the impact of one individual is absolutely massive. But for the majority of us, I feel like individual action can often feel a bit futile. Sort of, it's very hard to visualize the effects that we're having on such a small scale, but each one of us is just a tiny part of this bigger whole, so we might not feel like we're making a difference, but we model our actions on those who we respect, and so individual action can really matter a great deal. It's this idea again of leading by example, and the more people that do it, the more impact that you can have. Yeah, so I guess the takeaway message that we hope that you've gotten from this is that individual action is important, and individual behaviour then goes on to inform group behaviour, which can influence bigger company behaviours, which can then influence governments. It's all linked. So, for example, buying an electric car might inspire someone else to go plant-based, who might inspire someone else to then be more sustainable in their day-to-day life. I think sustainability can look different for different people. It doesn't have to be this blanket, everyone acts the same kind of thing. But it starts with an individual, I think. And
it's really important to recognise that, and which is why I was quite keen to talk about the importance of intersectionality, which kind of links into what you just said. So it's I actually was not 100%. I kind of knew what it was, but I actually was not, entirely aware of how it impacted me, for instance. So intersectionality in your environmental practices, but also in many other different practices, it's a kind of an outlook which can apply itself very nicely to a lot of different things, I guess. Things, concepts, ideas, anyway, ideologies. Intersectionality is about kind of recognizing that people's circumstances are different, and in this context, therefore, their environmental practices are different. Kind of what matters is that everyone does something. It's not necessarily always the same thing, and expecting everyone to do the same thing is unreasonable, because people have different resources, different access to resources. So, for an example of that, plant-based diet, all the evidence suggests that a plant-based diet is preferable to a meat-based diet. And, that's something we should all strive for. But it's not feasible for everyone. In some parts of the planet, meat is either, quite sustainably harvested with low environmental impact, or it's the most important and nutritious part of an otherwise very limited diet. So how do we apply the concept of intersectionality to this idea that we all want a plant-based diet? So this is just a personal example, the way I do it. So I'm neither vegan nor vegetarian. My diet is plant-based, and I very occasionally eat the odd bit of meat or dairy or fish. But you can be discriminatory with what you eat and the kinds of food that you eat. So I wouldn't eat a steak because I don't want to contribute to the massive beef industry in this country. And I'm trying to tailor my diet to be as low impact as possible. So I very rarely eat animal products, but on the occasion that I do, I make sure that, for instance, none of the meat has been, farmed en masse, has a low environmental impact. I flat out won't eat beef or pork. Occasionally I'll have a bit of chicken, and that's fine by me because for my heritage, that's quite a prominent part of at least half of my family's culture. And that's fine by me. And if I ever eat fish, I make sure that it's either MSC certified, which means it comes from a population which is at least theoretically being harvested at sustainable levels, or farmed. Fish farming, we're going to do a whole podcast on, and the jury's out about whether it can be sustainable or not. But for me, it's preferable to depleting wild stock. And as I'm currently living with my family over lockdown, I have to make concessions because we were all working and schooling and things. So it's really important to recognise that whilst we all do have a moral obligation to do what we can do is not necessarily the same across all demographics of people and across people separated by geography. So there was a really nice kind of little statistic to kind of pop out about that. And I feel like diet is something which we talk about a lot, and it's something I worry about quite a lot, and what people our age might worry about quite a lot. And this is kind of just to reassure you, as Emma was saying, individual action does matter. So according to the UK Climate Change Committee's 6th annual budget, to achieve net zero, we will need to have a 20% shift away from all meat and dairy products by 2030, and a further 15% reduction of those industries by 2050. And in doing so, this will obviously reduce the livestock numbers and the amount of land for agriculture. And so if you can't cut out meat, but are willing to cut down your meat and dairy intake at the very least by 35%, then it is absolutely still worth doing it. Great if you can go the whole way and be plant-based. Cool if you can go even cooler if you can go and do vegetarian or vegan. But the impetus is not that you have to go the whole way. There is still value in doing what you can and what you do feel comfortable with. Hey, perhaps in the future, if we don't make any progress, then we will have to turn around and say, right, chaps, no, we've all got to be vegan, otherwise it's nothing. But at the moment, we're at a stage where we can afford that luxury of being just a little bit more discriminatory. It's an odd word to use. A little bit more nuanced, shall I say, with how we tackle these issues. And so I thought that was quite important to put out there.
Yeah, definitely. I do agree with that. I think a quote that you kind of see thrown around quite a lot is, we don't need a handful of environmentalists being perfect. We need billions of people being imperfect, and we just need people trying their best in order to make progress. Another really kind of important thing we wanted to chat about and make sure that we got into our discussion on climate change is the fact that there is no climate justice without social justice, and the importance of advocating for the rights of people and nature. And this is often referred to as the intersectional environmentalist movement, and it's absolutely fundamental in the fight against climate change. And both individuals, businesses and governments have a really vital role to play here. So every tier of that we've spoken about today is really important in this intersectionality. We really need to root out social injustice, and we mentioned this in the first podcast, in our institutions in order to progress in the fight against climate change. So this is at a national level. We need laws protecting minorities and ensuring justice. At a business level within institutions to make sure we have a safe working environment for all, and at an individual level with, you know, making sure you as an individual are behaving appropriately. This, you know, includes kind of anti-racism education, anti-sexism education, diversity training, all these really important aspects that just, we need to root out these problems within society in order to progress with the climate change, with tackling climate change. And specifically in relation to climate change, we see social inequality. So Robi obviously spoke about women and girls earlier. 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. And in terms of race, in the US, Black people are 3 times more likely to die from asthma-related causes. And with something like Hurricane Katrina, this massively disproportionately impacted Black communities compared with white communities. And as we said in part 1, climate change exacerbates inequality. But racial and other forms of inequality and conservation have never been separate entities, and so we cannot treat them as such. It's really important to remember this and to kind of fight these inequalities at every level if we have a chance of moving forward with climate change. And activism is obviously an important part of this kind of collective activism as we've spoken about. And another kind of link in between these systems is that obviously individuals decide the government through voting, as we discussed, and individuals also decide the market. So we have a huge consumer power. So our vote and how we spend our money really influences what governments and private companies do. So although it might seem that governments and private companies hold all the power, we really influence the decisions they are able to make.
And I think we're actually, you know, we could look at this moment that we're in now. This, you know, this word is bandied about a lot, and I do love a nicely bandied word. Unprecedented. Like this situation we're in at the moment with this shift and fundamental moment with how COVID-19 has made us reevaluate so much of our society. And you can really see that with the amount of kind of social justice causes which have really taken off in terms of visibility during the pandemic when everyone's inside. It's been an interesting phenomenon. And so, you know, we could really use this pandemic as a moment to understand the climate crisis a lot better, couldn't we?
Definitely. And the word unprecedented, I know we're all sick of hearing it, but it's really important to remember that the climate crisis we're in is also unprecedented. This is the first time a kind of global climate change has been caused by one species. I was thinking about this the other day when we were talking about this podcast, and I realised how linked the pandemic is, or how the pandemic kind of provides a perfect analogy to what we've spoken about. So if you've been listening to this really confused about what we've been talking about, I'm hoping this is going to clear it up for you, especially in terms of these 4 tiers of people and how they interact. So it's a lot easier for businesses to meet their targets or to go green with governmental support. It's also a lot easier for individuals to go green with governmental support. If you look at the coronavirus pandemic, no matter how well or badly you think your respective government has handled it, the actions of the government have had direct implications on the actions of individuals and businesses. So because of national lockdowns enforced by the government, restaurants and other businesses have had to close and people have had to stay at home by legal requirement. By staying at home, individuals are aiding the pandemic recovery and preventing the spread of COVID-19. By closing down, restaurants are aiding the pandemic recovery and preventing the spread because of limited interactions of people within the restaurants. Because we've all stayed socially distanced and inside, we have all contributed to ending the pandemic or helping to end the pandemic. Businesses that have temporarily closed or transformed their working life to work from home have also helped in ending the pandemic. However, all of this has been so much easier to do because of the government. Whether you agree with everything they've done or not, the fact that you have been legally told you have to stay at home means that you have helped prevent the spread of COVID-19. So while we all want the pandemic to end and we want to minimise the spread, the messaging and action from the government has been vital in predicting our behaviour. I think you can draw a really nice parallel here with climate change. So none of us want climate change. I think we all know that. I think even the CEO of Shell and BP, I don't think he wants climate change. But so much is needed in order for us to get there and stop climate change from happening. And we need support through that. Businesses aren't going to invest in renewables if they don't have to, because that is going to involve time and costs and research and a complete revamp of their current business model. In the same way, working from home has involved a huge amount of work and revamp the businesses just wouldn't have bothered for if they didn't have to, because why would they? People aren't just going to buy electric cars if the infrastructure to charge them isn't up to scratch. Why would we? We have perfectly good cars that already work. So we really need this collaborative approach from all sectors of society, which is exactly what we needed in the pandemic. And it is just so much easier to do something if the law is on your side. And that's why I think the government have a really vital role to play here in allowing individuals and businesses to play their role to their full potential. And I think the pandemic has proved that that's possible, and hopefully means we can do it again with the climate crisis.
It's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor.
I really like that
lining.
analogy. I like that
Yeah.
analogy because I think people might feel like, oh, okay, actually, yes, I am having an impact at the moment, and I could do the same in relation to the climate crisis.
Yeah, we've all played a part in this pandemic in preventing the spread, all of us, and we can all play a part in preventing climate change.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, maybe that's a good way just to end with, I guess, just a concluding message to you guys. Thank you for listening. I know this is a very long one, but yeah, we really wanted to make you feel like you can make a difference, because I think it's easy to feel disheartened by the enormity of tackling the climate crisis. It's not just something we can do tomorrow and suddenly it'll all be fixed. This is going to take time. But we hope that this podcast has made you feel that you are important. You do have an impact as an individual, as collective individuals. But also, we can't stop putting pressure on the big guys or gals. So those big companies, we have a lot of, like you were saying, consumer pressure. And through our exercising our right to vote, we then have pressure on the governments. So I think the fight against climate change just needs to be this collaboration between society, individuals, business and governments, and then we can actually start moving forwards in a positive way. So hopefully you feel a bit more empowered, like you can actually do something about this. You do matter. So yeah, just thank you for listening to this, and we hope you enjoyed this 2-part climate change.
And don't forget to comment and leave your opinions, in the comments. We'd love to know what you think. Do you think one of these tiers that we laid out has more of a role to play than another? Do you agree that they're all incredibly vital? We'd love to know what you think. So we will see you next time, and all the links to all of our social media where you can see more of our lovely, lovely content and more of us as presenters is in the links below, along with all our references for this podcast. So see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.